Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I know it's early in the day, especially. I'm not always at the conference for the things at the very start, but I'm glad you're here. And obviously, I made sure to be here in time this time. So effectively, my talk will give a kind of brief overview of the sorts of things that I've been doing. And as Jamie has kind of just given an overview, a lot of that's in memory, so there's a bit more emphasis on that bit, but also some of, I guess, my view on methods, and some of the work on mentorship, which effectively includes some of this research and is how I'm viewing things related to post-PhD careers. So all of that's kind of bundled in here. There's a few kind of separate parts to the talk. If you happen to tune out, especially because it's early in the morning, there'll be easily kind of parts to kind of reorient you at least to a separate part of the talk. And despite there being four parts, they are not all equal in length. So the first one's longer. It will still all work out. I will make sure the timing makes sense. So I'll go start with it. So one of the main things to do all of this work is I collaborate with a lot of people, including, I guess, many people mentored me. I had quite a few mentors at the University of Alberta in Canada where I did my PhD. There's a lot of close collaborators that have been involved in the work that I'm going to be telling you about. And then also colleagues that I've been collaborating with internationally. And of course, people at Nottingham that I meet with every day and go for drinks and talk about this research and apply for grants and day-to-day kind of have support, and all of that's important to being able to do the stuff I'm about to tell you about, which is the research that I've been doing over career thus far. So effectively, as I kind of just said, there's four parts to this talk. The main underlying thing is memory, and then I guess, and kind of this idea of focusing on experiences that are more memorable. What are those factors? How does that work? And then going into some slightly broader topics as well. So I'll start with this one that I described as risky decision making, but we'll bring it to memory in a few moments. So one of the broad questions that I've been interested in, and I guess the narrative to get there itself is more complicated, but one of the broad things is how do we make risky decisions? And what I broadly mean by that is where there's multiple possible outcomes, and at least in a simple sense, the two possible ways that you could make these sorts of decisions is you could be directly told these are the odds for different outcomes occurring, or you have to learn through experience where you get outcomes on different trials, or in instances, at least in a more broad and kind of real world sense. And you just have to learn through experience what the odds of these situations are and make decisions as you go of which thing you kind of would prefer to choose. So we'll start with something not quite memory, and I'll try and see how interactive people want to be. If I give you the choice that I'll give you 100% chance you just get 20 pounds, it's yours, no strings attached, or a 50-50 chance that you get 40 pounds, or maybe you get nothing. So it averages out to the same, but which one would you prefer? Who would take the guaranteed 20 pounds? Put up your hand. Okay, and who would take the gamble? People are choosing it, but it is much fewer. I guess I obviously have a different view than you have here. I didn't put a big mirror at the front so you can see your peers behind you. But most people would tend to choose the guaranteed win in this sort of case. Now, if I give you the same overall kind of situation, but have it as losses, you have to pay 20 pounds fixed, I'll just say cost or loss or however you want to think of it, or same idea, 50-50 chance you can lose 40 pounds or you lose nothing. Who would take the guaranteed loss? Okay, and who would take the gamble? And again, even though you can't see it, the sample size is still plenty to see that, first of all, the asymmetry is a lot stronger, but here people take the gamble, and that effect is even stronger than the kind of bias that we saw for gains. And obviously the slides are made in advance. I knew that was the kind of intended outcome. And that's a lot of research has gone in this sort of direction. Tversky's seminal work has been in this sort of domain. There's a lot of research on decisions from description. What I'm more interested in, to bring it to memory then, is decisions from experience, where you don't know what the odds of different outcomes are. Here, at least, let's say on a machine that looks like this, maybe you know what the outcome possibilities are. There's varying amounts of that you can win, but you're not sure, and maybe it's a little bit hard somewhere in the casino. Maybe they have to disclose it, but it's definitely not super transparent what your odds are. In the stock market, no one knows exactly what the odds are of different possible outcomes. And in maybe a little bit more daily kind of situation, let's say you're at the parking meter. If it's somewhere that you frequent, maybe you know at a certain time of day, you can go in the shop for a couple of minutes, no one's going to check. versus if you know every hour, 5 minutes past the hour, someone comes by, you should make sure you put the coins in before you go in. Different situations, you might know some of the odds, but again, from experience. And this is, I guess, more towards real world situations of what I'm interested in, but not what I'm doing in the actual study. What we do in the study is we show people on the computer screen two door images, at least I'll say most of the time, and people make a choice. Let's say this person chose the yellow door on this particular trial, and then they won 40 points. With some other door images, someone makes a choice, they lose 20 points. And they do this for hundreds of choices. We do have some control conditions where there's a gain versus a loss, so we can see people actually paying attention and not just choosing randomly. We also have some instances where we just give you one option, you have to choose it. So you can't just completely ignore, let's say the red door looks scary, or like you got a bad outcome once and you never again. We have some things to balance that out. But the more interesting bit are questions that are kind of like what I started with, where there's an equal expected value. On average, they're the same type of outcome with gains or with losses, and see what you do. So the actual thing, as I kind of described before, but now with this experience situation, is the odds are 50-50 between the outcomes. We don't show this to participants. This is kind of in the experiment, kind of behind the scenes, how it runs. Sometimes we've rigged it so that over, let's say, 20 choices, the yellow door is exactly 10 and 10. Sometimes we just let it kind of be random, but there are effectively kind of the same odds behind the scenes of how these decisions are made. Why I'm telling you about any of this is that we find differences. So with description in the study, we show people just text labels or pie charts. We've done other variations, but this at least from the specific study that I'm going to show you the results from in a moment. We choose, there's no outcome here because you are just learning from description. There is no feedback. So that's also a bit of a difference between these two types of decisions. And then we also have losses then as well. The whole point is that this ends up mattering, and that with description, we find people are more risk seeking for losses than gains. So the y-axis here is how often people chose the risky option. It is generally, it still ends up being less than 50-50. So people are generally risk averse, but they are sufficiently more risk seeking for the losses than the gains, which is also what we saw with the people putting up their hands. At least people in the back can hopefully attest and agree to that. Jamie at the front has no idea what anyone else voted. But also in this, at least in this particular experiment, one of the things that isn't done so often is I did this all within subject, and actually with the exact same numbers, we alternated between different blocks of trials. And with an experience, we have the exact opposite kind of crossover effect then, where people are much more risk-seeking for gains than losses. Again, they are overall risk-averse, fine, but this is all four of these bars are within subject, and people are effectively just processing that outcome information differently, at least the odds information, into the choices that they make. And that's what's motivating this line of research. Why is that? And then what I'm basically going to focus on for the next set of studies I'll be telling you about is decisions from experience without having description mixed in, but varying some of the procedural elements to try and figure out what matters. And at least as a slightly spoiler, memory is important, but still there's a little bit more nuance than that. So many people have looked at the description versus experience in these type of decisions. There's a whole effect name for it called the description experience gap. There's a TICS paper from 2009 that goes into it, but I'm not really as interested in the fact that there is a gap. That's great. That means that there is a difference in how they're processed. Some things that can matter are, well, obviously you're stating odds. You could think of how people are thinking and experience. They could be thinking back to some recent outcomes and sampling. The fact that there's feedback on all of these, there's just a lot of procedural differences. But the main thing that I'm interested in is that experience relies on memory, and then how does that come into play? How do some manipulations of how memory might be involved in this task end up bearing out in the choices that people make? So as I kind of said already, decision from description, lots of people have studied that. Sure, there's 1,000 papers on that. I'm not as interested in there. There's probably 1,000 papers on descriptions from experience as well, but the first pile is bigger. And I'm more interested in these decisions from experience. So using the same procedure that I kind of have already outlined here in a different experiment now, but using this part of the procedure without having description mixed in, we looked, this is different data and plotted a little, like the bars are a little bit wider and stuff here, but in gains versus losses, people are more seeking for gains than losses in these decisions from experience. In this particular study, we did quite a few experiments, so I'll try and show you a little bit of a summary in a moment. One thing that we thought is that maybe the fact that sometimes you get zero as an outcome is a little bit odd. The fact that you won zero or lost zero, maybe that isn't as salient in memory because it's kind of a non-outcome. So what we did is we tried to shift the numbers and say, what if it ends up being that instead of 0 and let's say 20 versus 0, 40 as let's say in gains, we shifted 5 values away and losses 5 away in the other direction so that it's winning is between 25 points and getting 545. I guess also I forgot to say, people are paid monetary bonuses based on how well they do in this experiment. So these values do matter. They do, at least an experience kind of portion of the task, have a thing at the bottom of the screen telling them what the kind of current balance is so they can see that number going up by whatever feedback value we tell them, and then you can actually, again, pay them out based on the performance. But yeah, in the second experiment, then we shifted the values up by 5 in each way. Overall, this sample seemed to be more risk-seeking, just the means are higher, but still found a comparable effect between gains and losses, the within-subject difference of how much more risk-seeking they are for gains and losses. So in this study, there's a few different things, so I'm going to show you a little bit of a kind of way of summarizing it. I'm just going to focus on the difference between the two conditions. So instead of showing you 2 bars, one for gain, one for loss, I'm showing the difference, which for now is this blue bar. And the initial values for experiment 1, which is kind of our baseline for this set of studies, is you either get, again, 20 points when you win or 0, 40 as your gamble, and comparable values for losses. As I just showed you, in a second experiment, we shifted it out by 5 kind of in either way and got a comparable effect. Then we started doing something that's a little bit more interesting to try and, again, figure out what's actually important here, and tried to have actually 8 doors instead of 4. And we made one set where we actually just doubled all the numbers. So you could win 40 points or get 0, 80, like 50-50 odds of that. So that one ends up being more extreme, more salient. And the second set that's all mixed together is the same values from experiment 1 with 20, 0, 40. So now we have the same values from before in the context of something that stands out even more. And in the values that are relatively extreme, which is the now doubled ones, the one that's in the blue bar for this set, we did still find this effect that you more are seeking for gains and losses in the values that are more extreme. But the choice preference was not different from, I guess, no different between gains and losses for the intermediate set, which is identical values to the first experiment, though each experiment had a different group of participants. In the fourth experiment, we did 2 separate groups. In one group, we shifted all the values 40 up, so everything was a gain. That's hence the 4G there. So now it was minus 40, but to 0. Otherwise, you're making basically a choice between getting 60 points or getting 40 or 80. And another choice where you have losses, where we shifted everything down. Lots of numbers, I know. But the main thing is, when we shifted those things around, it still got the overall relative effect, which is, in this case now, more is seeking for higher value outcomes than for lower value outcomes. So all of this comes together. We didn't actually show anything with memory here, but the interpretation of this was that the values that are extreme are maybe more salient in decision making. And then in the next study, I'll tell you about it in a moment, we showed this in memory. So effectively, you have, at least from this first study, 5 different outcomes could occur. But if they're all equally represented, you shouldn't have any bias between gains and losses. But what we were suggesting happens is that the most extreme values stand out, at least let's say for now in decision making. If you think the plus 40 happens more often than it actually did, you should be risk seeking for gains. If the minus 40 stood out more often as kind of a subjective bias, then you should be more risk averse because you want to avoid that minus 40 because it stands out. And then we shift our values across the experiments. The 45s would be the ones that stand out in that study. But in this case of shifting everything up, now 0 actually should stand out in one case or the other case, depending on it being the best or worst outcome that could happen within that whole experimental setting. So at least here, we could think, okay, maybe this actually is kind of convergent, at least with our results, and gives us some explanation of what we've been finding. So this is what we call the extreme outcome rule in this initial 2014 paper, and then have looked at for about a dozen papers since. And then particularly tried to look at, could we describe this as being driven by memory? So in a subsequent study that also came out in 2014, we used the exact same choice procedure, but then afterwards we added a memory test where we asked people, what's the first outcome that comes to mind? Sorry, this is just the choice behavior from that study. Then we ask people, what's the first outcome that comes to mind for each of these doors? And we also ask them what's the frequency that they thought, because they know that it leads to multiple things for at least some of these instances. How often does it lead to it, and does that relate to the choices that they make? And then we do find that people more often would say that whichever color door, because that's counterbalance across people, led to 40 or 0. More people said the plus 40, and for losses, even a stronger effect, more people said the minus 40 than said the 0. So even though these outcomes happen equally often, when you have to report a single thing, the extreme value is the one that you're over-reporting. In this particular paper, we actually did have a version that also had all gains and then would find over-reporting of the 0 outcome. So we also can find that 0 actually stands up more in memory than a higher value when it is the most extreme thing that you've experienced in that task. And then with the frequency judgment, the effects are a bit weaker, but still, people overrepresent the outcomes that are the things that are more salient. So going back to the idea of memory and kind of what matters to you, the things that end up being kind of more outlier in a range sense, they happen very often still, but the things that are kind of the best and worst possible experiences within the situation stand out more and are actually driving the kind of decision-making behavior. I don't have the figures here, but we did also find correlational effects that those that are kind of over-representing these extreme outcomes does actually correlate to stronger preference effects in the decision-making task. So the next thing that we did that's just getting kind of more recent now is, can we get these different decision context effects within the same experiment? So for instance, I've said with gains and losses, we can get more seeking for gains than losses. With everything we shifted into a gain, I guess may as well put values on the screen. So we have gains and losses in one context, and the other context has high values and low values. Everything is a gain. But the low values and the gain are actually the same numbers. So now the question is, can we get both kind of relative effects, more seeking for gains than losses, and for high value than low value within the same person, within kind of alternating blocks of trials? The short answer is yes. So that's effectively the orange bars here are the same numbers, but we do find the kind of relative pairing effects that by having different visual cues, so borrowing from the memory literature, having different images, having background scenes that help you orient to having different contexts, and helping you segregate your experiences from each other, rather than the experiment as itself being the whole setting that you're trying to kind of learn and see what's happening in. It actually ends up being that these kind of different contexts are distinct from each other. And this paper actually had 4 experiments in it that I'm not showing you all of them here. And one of those, we did remove all the visual cues, but kept the overall kind of contingencies and outcomes the same, and then saw this effect disappear. So we made the context no longer distinct from each other. This effect does disappear. But otherwise, when you have these visual cues, when you have the range of outcomes that have this kind of pattern, you can actually see separations in the type of decisions that you make, because within a local kind of frame, you're making decisions based on what stands out to you. Here happens to be reward values, but otherwise the idea is kind of things that stand out in memory and are more salient are driving your behavior. One of the more recent things in making a little bit more episodic memory like that we've done somewhat more recently is, instead of having these numbers that are kind of repeated outcomes, we made all of the values come out in the hundreds instead of kind of in the tens kind of range. So we can have trial unique outcomes. So on one particular time, let's say, instead of saying you got 30 points, you got 305. And this gives us a kind of range, like this time I got 305, this time I got 373, this time you get some other outcome. We can then later test you and say, what actual outcomes did you get? And what we found here is people cannot really remember what outcomes they got. They don't know the exact values, but if we ask when they are giving us numbers, they are generating numbers that are consistent. They're in, let's say, the right hundreds kind of range. They have a sort of gist of the numbers were around there. They learned kind of the rule of what was happening, but their episodic memory for what actually happened is very poor, the upper row of figures there. And obviously we did some variations in the procedure, hence there being these 3 different experiments. So part of how we've kind of progressed from this now is bridging between, in some degree, trying to look at episodic memory and memory for these different trial outcomes, along with a procedure that was actually designed to be done comparatively. We've done some of similar procedures with pigeons in the lab that we kind of started this work in. So we've also been able to kind of link it into operant conditioning type research and look at how memory systems are interacting. And that's a kind of underlying thing that I'll come back to again. Where we've gone from here, lots of different ways. We've tried to look at effort as opposed to reward as a different domain. We've tried varying the odds over time. We've intermixed some things to look at kind of curiosity type effects, as well as more looking towards episodic memory side by having delays between earlier choices and subsequent choices and memory tests, as well as trying to vary how many trials do people have to learn from, so we can look more in a categorization literature kind of way and see how people are kind of shifting from episodic memory, literally episodes and instances, to having something more gist and rule-like, and looking at the kind of gradient over time. So those are some of the more in progress bits. So hopefully that was a bit interesting. Now I'm going to switch topics a bit though. Still, again, I have some mini talks in a sense here. Still within the overall range of these, but now I'm going to focus on emotion for a bit. And then there will be a point where these hopefully kind of tie together again. So some other research that I've been doing is looking at emotion and association memory. And the idea is generally emotional things are more memorable. But what happens when you're trying to associate information to something emotional? The fact that you're focusing on something emotional might have some detriments, or the fact that emotional things are memorable might kind of have some overarching effects and have some generalizations to the things around them. So some studies have found more towards impairments, but maybe it's that people are getting distracted and say there's attentional effects, that they're not having the sufficient opportunity to learn what's being associated, like the fact that these links are there. So in one of the first studies that I did, I guess still as a grad student then, was to try and control for this. So one thing we did was we used words in the study. We showed the words sequentially so that they're not competing for attention. We had people intentionally learn that these words go together, and we had practice instances and kind of repeated study test cycles. Again, as I just kind of said, we presented sequentially. We use words versus pictures. Pictures are complicated. There are a lot more kind of nuance of stimuli. That might be a reason why people are doing worse. And we also looked at how related information is, emotions, an overall category. We had some control conditions where we had equivalently interrelated concepts without having emotional aspects to them. So for examples of some of the words that we used, they're not more than you'd see, let's say, in a news article, but, and I guess here we focused on negative emotion, but those are words that are more salient, and we did find kind of memory effects for them. But the idea was to learn that some of these words are associated with something else. How well can you form those associations on a several minutes kind of time scale and be tested on them? So overall in our procedure, we use what's called cued recall. So you'd learn that these two things go together. We'll give you the first one, you have to recall the second one. Or we can go the other way around and say, given the second word, tell us what came first. So that gives us these forward and backward tests. And then I know the notation's a bit confusing, but the big ends are negative, the small ends are neutral. So we have some pairs where you have two negative items together, some pairs where you have two neutral items together. People actually did better with two neutral ones. The accuracy is a little bit higher than when you have two negative things together. We did an item memory test and people could recall more of the negative words, but when learning the association, the idea that this thing leads to that, and being able to do the episodic memory test, people were worse with the negative, with the emotional content. We also had these middle ones here, where in this case, you're in each case trying to recall a neutral word. So this controls for the effect that negative things are easier to recall, but we're giving you either a negative or a neutral word as a cue. And in these particular conditions, you're in both cases trying to recall something neutral. And again, from this set of kind of highlighted bars, you can see that the middle ones, the ones that are in that sense, and not the two small ends, are lower than the neutral condition, which again is suggesting you're doing worse when there's negative content involved in the memory, as opposed to the two things being neutral. The overall design is a little bit more complicated. We did some math modeling, and that's partly why it's done in this kind of factorial approach. But the end point of this study was that negative information is actually making things harder to form associations. And maybe that's also kind of, let's say, related to things like the weapon focus effect, but removing some of these confounds like attentional biases, but just that emotional things are hard to link between different types of contexts. We tried to think like, okay, as I just showed you those words, maybe they're not emotional enough. There's some artifact of this low arousal kind of emotional information. In that same paper, we tried to use taboo words. It's interesting in its own way to do the norming and to use those in a study. I'm not showing you those as examples here. I'm not sure you can put the video on YouTube. Well, probably could, but still, they're just words. But more so, the kind of outcome of that study ended up being that taboo words are different, especially, I guess, the second reference in QJP that came a bit after. Taboo words are different. They are higher in emotional arousal, but they also have a kind of tabooness, social norms thing where it's kind of like you shouldn't really be seeing this, that also kind of mixes in and has other effects that are beyond emotional arousal. Now, for the first study and for the set here, we wanted to use words because they're easier to control for. It's easier to test for memory. You can type a word out. Images are a lot more complicated. But for some reasons, including trying to see what's actually happening in the brain and trying to get stronger emotional responses, as noted here, we did use pictures then for a follow-up study. So we had to make some changes to the design. You can't, again, just type it out. I have done some studies where I ask people to describe an image, still more complicated. So I'd rather not go into that. And we used basically a hybrid associative recognition procedure with queued recall and made some changes so that we could do this in the scanner. So briefly what the design is, you see here we would show things simultaneously, partly with the scanner and trying to resolve different images, brain activity from each other. We just showed the two things at once. When we test your memory, we'd show you one of the two images. It could be the left or the right image. We ask you just, can you recall the associate? You respond yes or no, effectively kind of subjective response. But then we do ask you for an objective one, basically choose out of that array of 5 images. All of them are from the same study set, so you've seen them equally recently. Choose which one it is. And then ideally, these kind of match together. When you say yes, you're more likely to choose the image. If you said no, sometimes you can still recognize it. But from all of these, and I guess kind of a variation of several procedures, then we also then looked in the brain to see what's happening. Behaviorally, this effect looks very small, but it was very reliable across all subjects. This was slightly before showing individual subject data in the plot was a thing that you would do, so I don't have that there. But I did look at those when I was collecting the data to know that basically everyone showed the effect. It was very reliable. And we've actually run multiple fMRI studies, as I'll briefly kind of be mentioning. So it does replicate quite well. In the first study from this, we did high resolution fMRI of just the medial temporal lobe. So effectively, we only reliably, across participants, scanned the green area there. So we could focus particularly on the hippocampus and amygdala and know what's going on over there. We did find subsequent memory effects for these associations, and they're comparable for negative and neutral. So that's slightly contrary to finding all these behavioral effects. But what we did find then is specific subsequent memory effects for negative pairs related to the amygdala and for neutral pairs in entorhinal regions that were, again, selective to that. So they're showing that there's some difference in how emotional information is processed and kind of bound together than for neutral information. A downside of this study was we didn't have the prefrontal cortex at all to know what's happening there, how executive function is kind of interacting and guiding some of this. So we effectively ran the exact same procedure, didn't do the high resolution fMRI, did, I'll say, regular resolution fMRI, but had the whole brain, different cohort of participants though. And they're replicated the entorhinal effects, but also using what's called the PPI, if you're an fMRI person, but looked for interactions and found in dorsomedial PFC was related to the hippocampal kind of effect, though we found in a different region, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex was associated with how people learn the neutral pairs and affected, well, I guess hippocampal effect for the negative ones. So we did find some differences in kind of actual connectivity and kind of processing related to these two different effects. And the overarching thing again is that with these negative images, you're actually worse at associating things. Now, going more into I'm trying to explore how memory systems interact. One of the things that I've kind of tacked onto this sort of procedure now is similarly ask people to learn these two images go together. In this case, only one of them is negative or neutral. So it's slightly more in line with conditioning type research. But then we would take the thing that's always neutral in a design sense and then ask people to give a valence rating. We did also test for episodic memory, and that was actually quite poor in this study. But the main thing is we did find valence effects where people were more likely to judge something as kind of on average more negative if it had been associated with something that was negative, even though they didn't have that great of episodic memory for it. That effect was stronger when people did have the episodic memory, but also now going into the direction of how episodic memory and that type of overall memory and kind of testing, where you learn that different things are paired together in a one-shot, one-trial kind of way, is actually aligned with looking at things that are more associative, or sorry, more conditioning-like, and associative in that way, where you're not necessarily explicitly consciously thinking of the association and how they fit together. So a lot of directions have gone from here, looking into positive emotion, because that is somewhat neglected in literature, looking at how social aspects of the images, so like if it's a negative image that involves scenes of people versus animals or objects that still end up being having emotional kind of aspects of how that interacts with this. And that's also like some of this previous work and the one just kind of noted here in all eye tracking to kind of more probe that system, as well as looking at people with autism to see how that might also further interact with it. Looking at emotion effects on memory for durations. So if you think something is longer or shorter because it had emotionality within it, using VR with that, and also trying to bridge this more with conditioning literature and looking at anxiety effects with colleagues at Nottingham now. So that's the overall memory bit. I'll try and make sure maintain the pace to go through the other bits here that are kind of still big picture a bit. So from all of this, I've been thinking about what is episodic memory? How do we define it? How can we move the definition forward over these subsequent decades from how Tulving has defined it? And also thinking about how memory relates to how we view our own beliefs, how it contributes to society and kind of bigger scale things. And broadly, that's also come together in this book about memory that I've been putting together, effectively working on since my PhD over these last 10 years now, which is a bit of a tome, but trying to integrate to have a new way of thinking about memory that's not so much just about the kind of classical view of these are different memory systems, but more so in terms of some degree, I would say what's more interesting of how memory affects real life, even in say these more constrained experimental settings, but things that are more important and not just we get fossilized because something's semantically related or things that are a little bit more contrived procedurally. As Jamie had mentioned, I've also been doing other books before this. So even before I finished my PhD, I wrote this book on MATLAB that's still used at many universities internationally. And you might think from that and from my work and mentioning it, at least passively saying that I do eye tracking, that I'm very quantitative, and that generally had been true. But I think there is a kind of broad view that we can get different kinds of information, including kind of very rich data, depending on what kind of procedure we use in different ways. And as a kind of brief interlude into an example of that, one earlier study that I did on choice and memory, before the ones I've told you about now, we would show people words, they choose something, they get a reward value that would go over many rounds. Over time, people would learn to choose these things are high value, these things are low value. But when I was piloting this study with friends, kind of as I was an undergrad and graduate student doing this research, sometimes people told me that what they're really doing is kind of remembering to avoid certain things. They didn't, like, sometimes they remembered these things were high value, but in other instances, they remembered this thing gave a lower outcome. So basically, I should not choose this. And these are kind of mixed procedures or mixed strategies that would not be separable in the initial study. But then this led me to try doing a study where instead of having those two reward levels, we had a whole range of levels. So we actually had 6 different outcomes and kind of staggered how much reward outcomes you could get from the time. And that was just kind of from talking to participants and getting the idea that they learned to choose things and kind of these are high value, I should remember them, and otherwise learning to avoid things. And what we effectively found was a U-shaped reward memory function where the best and worst things were the things best remembered and the intermediate values were the worst. And that was actually a precursor to this extreme outcome rule that I described well earlier. It effectively was a different procedure and a different type of study and a different literature, but bridging from this is how participants seem to describe what they're doing. Like I didn't actually formally do a qualitative study of that, but that's kind of that sort of insight is what led me there. And some of the work that I've been doing now is also kind of bridging, but I guess all of those are also the work that I'm doing now. But some other more recent work looking at autobiographical memory, I've been looking at, say, objective, when we know what you've seen, looking at subjective ratings, looking at kind of more natural language processing using computational methods to look at similarity and consistency between things, but trying to bridge between methods. I also have a whole other line of work on brain structure and aging and developing new methods for that. How does the brain change with aging? That we should be looking more at shape and more richer kind of information than just the volume, the size of things. And this has led into a whole bunch of work in aging, as well as with different clinical populations through different collaborations. This is being recorded on YouTube if you want to look up the references later that I'm obviously going through too quickly. There will be an opportunity for that, sorry. I've also done some work looking across species now and kind of bridging outward and outward. And I think collaborating is an important part of that and kind of using the methods that are appropriate for the situation. To briefly talk about the career stuff, I'll also be around through this conference, obviously, can talk about it. I wanted to think about how can I best support my PhD students as I've been supervising them, looked into literature on doctoral education, summarized some of that in this European Journal of Neuroscience paper, but then also tried to, like, as students are actually graduating, what are career options that I can advise them on? And one of the general advices is to do what's called an informational interview, where people talk to people in different career paths, not trying to get hired, but to get information about what is day-to-day life in that type of career path. And ideally, at least in this case, I'll say focusing on people that did PhDs in psychology, talk about what their PhD was about, make them kind of relatable, and then see how that can be kind of parallel with an individual person's interests. Now, this is a thing that's great in, I'd say, any PhD student or even more senior might want to do as you're considering your career paths. But also, I thought, could I do something a little bit more substantive that's kind of a resource for everyone rather than everyone kind of solving things on their own, which is still necessary. And that led me to doing this larger project where I've interviewed a bunch of people that overlap with me as a PhD student or as a postdoc or I just met at conferences that I compiled into this book called Academia and the World Beyond. And effectively has 22 interviews, 10 with academics, 10 with non-academics. So here I tried to be kind of half-half. All of them had been on the job market relatively recently to when this book came out. And I give talks about this sort of research, and what became more clear is more guidance on the non-academic careers is what's needed, so that led to a whole other set of more interviews that were all non-academic. And now I had this new problem of I have a lot of interviews that are published in these books, so they're accessible, and hopefully your university library has access to them through Springer and their books kind of online access. But that's a lot to go through. I had suggested, say, at a lab meeting, different people read some subsets and basically do a journal club where you summarize them to each other, and you can figure out which ones are more relevant to you through that. But that is a lot. And that got onto, for instance, one paper that Jamie briefly mentioned then, where I've now started doing qualitative analyses of these interviews to say it's not just non-academic and academic, and try and get some structure into what kind of non-academic jobs there are, some that are more related to academics. So effectively people that you might even see, let's say, at a conference. So for instance, the people that work at the exhibit booths just outside this room, some of them, I don't know these people individually, but in principle, some of them have done PhDs, let's say with EEG, with eye tracking, with those sorts of equipment, and then now work for those companies in a technical position, in a sales position. Some people work for companies that develop software for making experiments. So for instance, PsychoPi is developed at Nottingham. Some of the people that work for that company that built PsychoPi, and otherwise, let's say competitors like Gorilla, also are people that did PhDs and know what people want in, like, in a researcher kind of sense, where effectively researchers are the clients, or at least someone that's interacted with. So they're all still within academia broadly. There's also jobs that are more leaving academia, where you use some of the skills that you learned, for instance, how to analyze data and use those in other settings. So this paper in QJP gives an overview of that, and effectively is designed to kind of lead you to, here's the more relevant interviews for you based on where in this kind of overall flow chart of sorts of interest your own things are. And I've continued to do more qualitative analyses from this set of interviews that I've now collected and effectively are online, and other people can analyze them too, or at least draw their own, like, learn about their own career path from it. But the idea is to make this as a resource that can be helpful, though probably not many people come to Bacon and talk about doing qualitative analysis. But I think it's important to do that for figuring out what is career path. Not everything is fMRI EEG to figure out in the brain, but what are you going to do after you finish and publish that study? So to give some summary of that, I went a little bit fast at the end, but again, I'm around here and happy to talk about all of this through the conference and after, if you email me or something. So the first two parts, I talked about two different lines of work that kind of look at how episodic memory and operant conditioning interact. And I think we do need to come back to the definitions of episodic memory and try and figure out how can we refine it. I remember as a PhD student, I read different of Tulving's papers, not as attentive to what year they're published in. I was a bit frustrated that some of the definitions weren't quite congruous. Over time, he was refining his own view of it, but I think we need to continue to do so in these decades since his kind of seminal annual reviews paper, where he last effectively defined episodic memory. But I also think I'll just say is wrong. It says some aspects of, well, episodic memory itself is uniquely human. And a lot of people in the comparative literature say episodic-like memory for that reason. And I think we need to figure out more objective ways to define memory that also trade off and are acknowledging still the phenomenology of the experience and vividness and things that go with memory that are not so just it's right or wrong. and find a way to integrate that. I don't have that answer yet, but I think that is a thing that we need to continue that dialogue and try and progressing. I think it's important to use a range of research methods, sometimes use qualitative, sometimes use brain imaging. You don't need to be an expert in all of the things, but then that's when you collaborate with other people, and someone will just say in your department, or even you can wander to, in the UK, the other universities aren't that far away. You can find someone relatively nearby or at a conference or somewhere that has the expertise to help you answer the questions that you think are interesting. And like I'm somewhat more methods oriented in some sense than everything else. I like solving problems. Find someone that will have kind of resonate, that they're interested enough, ideally from a different perspective, to help you figure out the thing that you think is interesting. And I think it's as supervisors and people that are more in the academic system, it's important to try and support trainees as they finish their PhD into whatever they do afterwards. The easy kind of issue is like you only know academia because that's what you followed yourself, but there are resources now. At least I saw. Otherwise, even on my website, I link to a bunch of papers and stuff about these that follow cohorts and talk about what kind of careers they go into. We can do better than that. We can talk about those things in lab meetings and have. So, for instance, I would have one lab meeting a month focused on professional development rather than kind of in-field academic papers, and try and find ways to discuss these things, and then you'll know yourself more about it. And then otherwise, finally, more, say, to the trainee, but really to all of us, it's important to think that careers are about the journey and not trying to kind of beeline to figure out what your final outcome is. It's good to try and prioritize figuring that out sooner than later. And that's also an answer that'll change over time. But the journey is important. Figure out what you want is important. And that's a kind of thing that meanders a bit as you go. And that's all of it. Thank you.